My company is Compass Metrics, and we have two business units. One does affirmative action planning and strategy, and the other side does diversity and inclusion metrics, analysis, and training like this. So we'll get started. So just our disclaimer, we're not attorneys. This is for informational and educational use only, and is not to be used as substitute for the advice of counsel. Let's talk about what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about the evolution of how we got from equal employment opportunity to affirmative action to diversity and inclusion. We'll talk about, does diversity really add to profitability? We're going to answer that question. And then we'll talk about some socio-psychological concepts related to it. So we'll just get right into it. We'll start with the evolution. So we have to start with who does what, and this is going to be a review for most people. Equal employment opportunity at the federal level applies to employers that have 15 employees or more, and the enforcement agency is the EEOC, or the state agency like we have here in Massachusetts, MCAT. And the state rules can be different here in Massachusetts. It's 7 employees or more, and all of the state protections come into play. Affirmative action applies to federal contractors, so that have 50 or more employees. That includes part-time or temporary employees, and $50,000 or more in federal contracts. So that $50,000 or more is cumulative. If you have two $30,000 federal contracts, you may have just surpassed the threshold. Now that only applies to federal contractors that are not banks or financial institutions. So does anybody know what the threshold is for a bank or financial institution? No? It's $1. So it's really easy to hit that threshold for a bank or financial institution. It's actually not that hard to hit the $50,000 threshold either. The enforcement agency is the Office of Federal Contractor Compliance Programs, which is a subdivision of the Department of Labor. And they are the auditing and investigation agency that takes a look at affirmative action plans. Their audits are randomized, which is that's their position, is that the lists are generated randomly, they know who has contracts, and then they submit audit letters out randomly, and anyone can be selected for audit. So diversity and inclusion is different in that it's a voluntary undertaking that any agency of any size, any organization can undertake. And there is no enforcement agency because it's completely voluntary. So let's take a look at how we got from one to the other. They teach us when we take diversity classes that this is a simple evolution. It started with equal employment opportunity, which we call diversity 1.0, in which when we said, all right, that's it, no more discriminating. We will now no longer consider people's demographics, their race, gender, national origin, skin color, disability status. We're not going to think about those things anymore because that will help people get back into the workforce. Well, then they said, all right, well, this isn't really working out so hot. So let's, for those agencies that we have federal control over, let's require affirmative action. So now it's not enough to not discriminate. Let's do some specific outreach and reach out to these populations and invite them into our workforce. And then that had sort of marginal success, and they're still working on that. There's still a lot of new regulations and things coming out for those of you that are affirmative action employers. I'm sure you've been inundated with information about that. And then there was diversity, which was 3.0, and inclusion is 4.0, but they really work together. There are a couple of great ways of explaining diversity and inclusion and their relationship. They say that diversity is being invited to the party, inclusion is being asked to dance. Diversity is having a seat at the table, but inclusion is having a voice at the table. And my favorite one, because we are analytical and we focus a lot on metrics and analysis, is that diversity is the measure and inclusion is the mechanism. So you know that you are leveraging those diverse viewpoints through the mechanism of inclusion, and you can measure whether your mechanism of inclusion is working well by looking at the diversity of your workforce. So they really kind of go hand in hand, and we're referring to them together. So this looks like a nice, neat linear progression, right? This looks like it goes pretty well. The reality, though, It's a scuffle between all of these concepts, particularly the two that are legislated. They're frequently at odds with each other. And so EEO says, all right, that's it, we're not going to consider anybody on the basis of any protected characteristics. Affirmative action applies to the same employers, but it says, all right, we're going to conduct specific outreach and analysis, and we're going to set goals on the basis of those same demographics. So how do they get the two not to bump up against each other? Well, this is how they do it. We'll do, this is the guidance from the government. Okay, we'll do this targeted outreach, we'll reach these populations, and then once we have them in the door, we will stop thinking about it immediately, and then we will not make any decisions on the basis of these characteristics. It's a little easier said than done. So, and that's tough for HR. When you get a hiring manager who has a whole other realm of responsibility and things that they have to know what's going on, it's really easy for them to say, all right, look it. They told us, HR told us that we have a goal for hiring women in job group X. So the next person we hire in job group X is going to be a woman. You can't do that because now you've hired her on the basis of her gender and you're butting up against CEO, even though you're trying to advance your affirmative action goals. So that's a real challenge. Diversity and inclusion can also pose a problem. It can also be really good. If you're working on your affirmative action efforts, but your diversity and inclusion team is out networking and they're managing the ERGs and all of those types of things, you definitely want to make sure that you get that information into your affirmative action plan. So as long as there's good communication, diversity and inclusion can really bolster your affirmative action plans, and then you get the additional ROI for your diversity and inclusion. Say, well, not only do we do all this for the sake of diversity and inclusion, but we also may just double the ROI by putting in compliance. So, but I have seen it go badly. I'll tell you a story. I had a client who brought me in to do affirmative action for them. They had just gotten through an audit, received a couple of violations, and they were in their conciliation period. And they just wanted to get through that conciliation period and pass in their reports and be done with it, much as anyone would. We had a diversity and inclusion initiative going on too. And I wanted to talk to her because I really wanted to just see if there was anything she was doing that we could use in the reports, if there was anything out there that we could additional credit that we could take for things that this company was doing. And she didn't want to meet with me. And I couldn't understand it. She canceled a lot of meetings, but eventually I did get the meeting. And we sat down and she was really excited. And she said, we have spent months working on our goals for hiring women for the next year. And she said, we are going to send out in a couple of days an email to all 11,000 employees telling them what our goal for hiring women will be for the next year. And I said, oh, all right, that's interesting, because we have 10 US locations, and the goals are set based on the internal incumbency and the reasonable recruitment area. So it's very unlikely that you'd have goals in the same group or for the same category of people, and it's really impossible if they would ever be the same goals. So how do we get to one goal out of these 10 plans? How do they tie back to that? She said, oh, I don't. So at that point, my hair stood straight up. And I said, oh, okay. And I was just having this, I was just imagining sitting across the table from an OFCCP compliance officer who had a copy of this email. So who knows where that was going to go. I do know some people told me later they were going to forward it out to their network, so this was even going beyond the company. And a copy of the email with that goal, a copy of the affirmative action plan saying, why did you tell us this and then you told them this? And unfortunately for her, in-house counsel agreed with me that that would be a very uncomfortable conversation, and the project got squashed. So every fear that she had about speaking with me was confirmed and affirmed, so I felt kind of bad about that. But she was allowed, they were allowed to send out the email, they were allowed to say that they have goals, just not what they were, just not to quantify them. So that was the compromise that we had there. But had I not insisted on the meeting, that would have come out, and they were already in audit. So it could have potentially been very uncomfortable. And also, I don't know if you know, if any type of a complaint that goes to EEOC, OFCCP calls them. They say, we're about to audit, let's say, we're about to audit Compass Metrics. Do you guys have any complaints over there for them? The letter may not have left their desk and it may not have hit mine yet. No data has been submitted. We've had no conversations. They say, yeah, they had a couple people complaining that, people of color were being terminated at a higher rate in this job group. So yeah, we do have a complaint here. OFCCP will decide before they even send you the audit letter. that is where they're going to focus. That's going to be one of their main focuses in their audit. So it's a little bit scary, and you have to make sure that the information that goes out is solid and doesn't have any cracks in it. But again, you can increase your ROI and increase your compliance by using your diversity and inclusion efforts. You just have to make sure that you use them wisely and think through all the possible implications. Good communication is key, as I think we all always say here at HR. So inclusion is not just about race, gender, sexual orientation, disability status. It's not just about differences. It's not just about the numbers. It's not about political correctness. And it's not about assimilation. Inclusion leads to compliance, yay. Brand loyalty and community relations, all good stuff. It's the right thing to do. It leads to better teamwork and morale and engagement. It allows people to bring their whole and authentic selves to work so that they're not spending their time trying to cover who they are or trying to assimilate into a culture they're not used to. They're spending their energy working on the business problems. And inclusion leads to agility, innovation, and profitability. That's the one we're going to come back to because that's the one that's not obvious. So first, when we think about, we've done a little talking about this already, but when we think about the word diversity, what characteristics come to mind? Let's just write them up here. Yes, ma'am.
A non-homogeneous workforce.
Yes. Non-homogeneous. Terrible. Okay, what else?
Multiple viewpoints.
Okay. Excellent. Anything else?
Just different backgrounds.
Great. Yes.
Understanding of different cultures.
Culture. You may have seen this before. This is our diversity iceberg. And this shows us all of the characteristics of diversity. But 90% of what makes us diverse lies below the waterline here. The only things we can sort of relatively see age. We don't see race or ethnicity because you can only see skin color. That doesn't tell you what somebody's race or ethnicity is. Their gender expression, it may not tell you their gender identity. And you can see behavior, but you can't see the reason for behavior. So if somebody is acting in a certain way that doesn't fit with your work culture, you want to sort of investigate that a little bit and find out what the reason is. Do they really not know better and they need to be coached? Or do they have something wrong with them, like a hidden disability that is causing this behavior which is actually symptomatic of that disability? And all of the other characteristics that we may not see lie below the waterline. And these are the things that make us diverse. These are the things that give us these diverse lenses. Like I said, background and culture and non-homogeneous. Even that everybody in this group, if we put a group of straight, white, physically abled men, they would all still have a lot of diversity within them. Why? So that is diversity and inclusion, but why? Why should we bring it in? Really, why? Like, it's warm and fuzzy, it's a good thing to do. Let's play a game. Does everybody have a piece of paper and a pen? All right, fantastic. Okay, we're going to play a game. This is an individual competition, so it's you against everybody else in this room. The person who wins, the best individual contributor, will be the person who comes up with the most number of animals that start with the letter that's on the next slide. You're going to have 45 seconds to do the best that you can to come up with that, the greatest number of animals you can think of. The person who has the most wins. So it's important that you try not to talk to yourself, because people will hear you, and this is all the honor system here. And all right, then you know what? Let me set up my timer here. All right, you guys ready for the letter? All right, the letter is G. Go. All right, you got about 20 seconds left. Ten seconds. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and stop. All right, how was that? How many people got 4? How many people got 4 animals? All right, how many people got 8? One person got 8. How many did anybody get more than 8?
Show off.
How many did you get?
I got 8.
You got 8 exactly? All right. Let's start. So you are the winner, the best individual contributor. You win a prize. Let's give them a hand. Our individual best contributor in 45 seconds came up with 8 possible solutions to what is actually kind of a complicated problem. G is not an easy letter, is it?
No, it's not.
Seems like it's going to be, but then it isn't. But our collective responses were 15. We had almost twice as many possible solutions to this problem in the same amount of time. So collectively, the team always outperforms the best individual contributor. So this, and we'll get into this in a second, but there's research going back to the 1800s that proves that the diversity of lenses provides faster, better, and more possible solutions to complex problems. In the 1800s, there was a cattle ranching contest, and a scientist set out to prove, I can't think, he wasn't a very nice guy, he was setting out to prove something kind of rude. But he ended up proving at this cattle ranching contest, they had a contest to guess the weight of a slaughtered and dressed steer. And at this contest, they had about 800 people. They had butchers, they had feed farmers, they had clerks, they had ranchers, they had all kinds of people. Even though this was Great Britain in the 1800s, where they didn't have a whole lot of cultural diversity, they had diversity of knowledge. So the person who won the steer, in sort of that guessing number of jelly beans contest, was within 5 pounds of the weight of the steer. The scientists then took the 800 responses and averaged them together. The average response was within 1 pound of the weight of the steer. So the team collectively got much closer to the actual weight. This method was also used by the World Health Organization in 2003 when the SARS pandemic hit. Prior to 2003, welcome! Welcome to the group. The fastest time that anyone had been able to sort of isolate and start to deal with a pandemic of that nature was 18 months. And the World Health Organization had invited the best and the brightest labs, and they said, oh, you know, but this time, they were like, this one is moving so fast, we're going to be in trouble. Anybody who wants to join us, we're going to have a phone call every 24 hours that catches us up. Small labs, big labs, new labs, old labs, award-winning, just established, anything. You're all welcome, let's do it. And the SARS pandemic was isolated and they had a treatment plan within 3 months. So they really cut down on their time by doing that. Now, does anybody know how this exercise was different than, let's say, a brainstorming session?
We had a lot of pressure.
A lot of pressure on
45
you.
seconds. A lot of
It's
pressure.
tough to think of all your zoo animals, yeah. So what we did here, in a brainstorming session, we have to try to avoid groupthink, right? So if I had said, everybody shout out animals that start with G, people would have started to sort of assimilate to the more dominant personalities or the more, people who felt really confident in their G animals. What we did here was we forced everybody to think about it from their own lens and through their own perspective and write it down so they're committed to it. And then we compared answers, and that's how we avoided groupthink in our brainstorming session. And now if we did have a business problem and we had 15 possible solutions, now we can start talking about, does giant actually make a tortoise start with G? Or does, does insect count? Is that part of our problem? No, maybe it is, maybe it isn't. But this technique works best when you have a complicated problem to solve. And we wouldn't really need this type of a method if we were just looking for how to change the light bulb in this room. We just need somebody with a light bulb and maybe a ladder and we'd be fine. But business problems are much more like the former. And there's a new McKinsey report that came out just this year, in January of 2015, that talked about, they studied gender diversity and racial diversity in businesses that compete against each other. And what they found was that the top quartile of companies in their industry and their sector outperformed the bottom quartile when they had a lot of gender diversity by 15%. So that's a direct link to their profitability. When there was a lot of racial diversity with that same makeup, they outperformed their competitors by 35%. And Forbes did an article on this, and there's some resources at the back of the slideshow that I can, if you guys want a copy of the slideshow, I can send it to you. Just leave me your email address, and it has the resources and those two reports in it. So why are we all doing this? Like, why haven't we all been like, yes, let's diversity, absolutely. What's in our way? Because this is directly linked to how we can serve our clients and how we can solve our problems and come up with better products and relate to our communities. Really 4 socio-psychological concepts that we tend to study when we get into diversity and inclusion. The first one is implicit association. Implicit association is a completely neutral and benign construct. It was first identified by Dr. Mazarin Banaji and Anthony Greenwald when they were coming up with the implicit association test from Harvard. Has anybody ever heard of that? It's really interesting. If you Google it, you have to be prepared for it because it will show you where your biases are. So if you think that you're a completely unbiased person, don't take it, it will ruin your day.
What is that called again?
The implicit association test. And that's in the resources here as well.
Oh,
You can
okay.
also Google it. Implicit association refers to the hardwired mechanism in the human brain that makes us prefer things that we are familiar with. And this starts before we're even born. An infant who has not been born yet can recognize the sound of its mother's voice compared to other sounds. At 3 months old, an infant will show a preference for looking at the face of a person, a stranger, who is the same race as their caregivers compared to other races. And by 10 months old, a child or a toddler will show that when they did this experiment, they had 2 kids. One, their caretakers spoke English, and they had a stranger offering a toy, 2 strangers offering a toy. One stranger spoke English, like the child's caretakers, the other one spoke French. The child wanted the toy from the English-speaking caretaker. Then they switched it, and the child went with the French-speaking person who offered them the toy. So we start to demonstrate this pattern for preferring what is familiar to us very early on in life. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's a survival strategy. It's good for us. From there, we start to get into unconscious bias. Bless you. And again, unconscious bias is not necessarily a bad thing. When we have unconscious biases in the workplace, we call them qualifications. So if we're looking for a chemist and we get a poet resume, we're not even I don't even need to read this. I don't need to think about this. So it's an easy decision. Unconscious biases are also based on our experiences, though, and they can be learned. So when they're based on misinformation about a group of people or stereotypes, they can start to be maladaptive. Then we get into unearned privilege. Unearned privilege is rarely, if ever, a good thing. It comes from belonging to the dominant class of people, the dominant group of people. And you're given the benefit of the doubt in ways that other people who don't belong to that dominant class are not given. And then there are microaggressions. Microaggressions are small, unconscious, very subtle slights that build up over time. And it's been compared to that saying, death by 1,000 pecks. It's not the individual, it's not each individual microaggression, it's the cumulative effect of all of them that leads to disengagement, also leads to depression and anxiety and all sorts of bad things on a human level from a workplace standpoint. You're looking at a lot of lost productivity. So let's delve into each one of these. I think we did a pretty good job with implicit association. So let's start with unconscious bias. So let's take the next slide, and we're going to see if we can trigger your unconscious biases right here, right now, with these 2 pictures. The picture on the left, the bear. If you found yourself standing in front of a bear who was making that face and you were mere feet away, humans have the ability to think symbolically. So you would not think to yourself, oh, his teeth are kind of pointy. He looks a little bit angry. You know what? It might be worse. He might look hungry. I don't think I'm gonna hang out. It's way too late to actually put together all of these aspects and then decide what plan you're gonna take. You see the bear and you go, oh, bad news, and you take off. That's the whole thing. Now similarly, but again, it's shaped on your experiences. So let's say you're a bear trainer or a bear handler, and maybe you know that bear, and you know that he's not growling, and he's not angry, he's smiling. Maybe you want to run right up and give him a hug. Maybe that's your reaction. I don't know, it's not mine. I'm not a bear trainer. Or on the other side, you have the berries. The berries are something that you would have an unconscious bias towards. Most unconscious biases are biases in favor of something. So, again, you don't stand in front of the berries and go, oh, those look kind of red and juicy. And I think I'd like to know a little bit more about these berries. Because your competitor is going to come up and snatch your berries before you have a chance at them. So you just go, oh, that looks good, and you snatch them and run away. And then you can think about it more later if you want to. But again, based on experience. So if you're allergic to berries, and your experience of berries has been one that involves hives and itching and all of those unpleasant things, you might see the berries and go, oh, berries! I'd rather deal with the bear. Okay? So that's an example of how our unconscious biases are good for us. They're in play. It's never going to go away because it's hardwired and it's a survival strategy. It's good for all of us. Here's an example of where unconscious bias is no longer adaptive to the world we live in. These two photographs were taken in 2005 during Hurricane Katrina. Everybody remembers that. People were in basic survival mode. There was no interaction between the person who took these photos and the people on the ground. These photos were taken from a helicopter, so it's not like there was a conversation that was had between them. And yet, the person of color on the top is looting, where the white people on the bottom are finding bread. And that's the editor's unconscious bias coming through and saying, well, we know that there were people stealing things. It must have been the person of color because my experience has been shaped in that manner. And the white people must just be in survival mode. So this is where it's no longer constructive, and it does play out today. We just have to, the good thing about it is that the more you become aware of it, anything that can be learned can be unlearned. So as you start to be aware and as you start to bring these things forward to yourself, it becomes easier to see, easier to distinguish, and much easier to interrupt. Biases are most likely to be triggered when you encounter a visible identity. I wrote these down so I can get them right. When you're feeling stressed, when you need to make a quick decision, when you're in cognitive overload, raise your hand if this starts to sound like your everyday workday. When you're multitasking, when there's ambiguity, when there's a perceived lack of accountability, or when you're fatigued or tired. That is my workday every day. And I think it's probably true of you guys too. So biases are most likely to be triggered when we're already thinking about too many things, we have too many things going on, and we have to make a snap decision. So, the links do become easier to distinguish and interrupt as you become used to them. So I do recommend that if you come to the point where you'd like to take that implicit association test, that you do that and you learn that it's okay that you'll have biases in favor of and against other things. And what is your stronger association? So that you can become aware of it and you can start to expose yourself to things that will start to weaken that implicit association for what you're familiar with. So unearned privilege, like we said, comes from belonging to the dominant group of people. There's male privilege, being perceived as a male, white privilege, being perceived as white, hetero privilege, class privilege, cisgender privilege, ability, religious, and linguistic privilege. Linguistic privilege is one of the things that I think is the most interesting, where your language, accent, or slang doesn't detract from the ideas that are being expressed. So I always thought that was an interesting one, where we have, with some teenagers are out and we just don't know what they're saying anymore. They're talking to each other and they almost have their own language. So that's always an interesting one for me. Another example of course, privilege can be related to class or gender or socioeconomic status or race. Another example of being out of an unearned privilege is being right-handed. Do we have any left-handed people here? Excellent. What was it like to find a desk at school? It's terrible. Why?
Sit sideways.
You have to sit sideways or have your elbow dangle. Yeah? What's it like to go to a dinner party where the table's round?
Oh, I just elbow my husband. Don't worry about it anymore.
It's perfect, sit next to your spouse.
My mother was left-handed, she would tell stories about in grade school, they would tie her left hand behind her back and try to teach her to be right.
Exactly. The message that unearned privilege gives us is who you are is not okay. And that's a very good example. People being forced to learn to write with their non-dominant hand. The message is, we don't care how good a job you do. Do what you have to do to be like the rest of us, even if it's a poor job. And that's not a way to bring forward anything that's positive in another person. Does anybody know this? Does anybody know who these two men are? Who are they?
Samuel L. Jackson, Lawrence Fishburne.
Very good, right. Does anybody remember the situation that took place maybe about a year ago now in the entertainment news world? This white news anchor, Sam Rosen, was interviewing Samuel L. Jackson and started asking him about a project that Lawrence Fishburne was actually working on. So Samuel L. Jackson, being who he is, took the next 6 or 7 painfully long minutes to hilariously and appropriately dress this man down. And the video went viral. And to his credit, Sam Rosen was he was like, I can't believe I'm that guy. He was horrified through the whole thing. So, but in fairness, he had one job, and that was to know who he was talking to. So I don't feel bad for him that Samuel L. Jackson took him down a peg. But by all measures of the success of an actor, Samuel L. Jackson is actually a much more accomplished actor than Lawrence Fishburne. He got his Hollywood Walk of Fame star much earlier. He has been nominated for more awards. He's received more awards. He's been cast in more blockbuster films. When this type of unconscious bias outplays, when this type of microaggression, microaggression is a very new term, I'm going to tell you. It was micro-inequity prior to that, so I'm just getting used to the latest and greatest, so I might use the terms interchangeably. I see this more as a micro-inequity because it was his unconscious bias playing through. And Sam Rosen did not mean to cause this much trouble. But the effect on these two people as professionals was that what happens in our workplaces is that if you have somebody who's a director who might be of Southeast Asian descent, and there's also an administrative assistant on a different floor who is of Southeast Asian descent, if they are the only two, and you continue to confuse their names, the message that the director will get is it does not matter what you accomplish. We will never see you as anything other than the lowest association that we have in our mind. And the director will come to the conclusion, no, I'm not going to be able to be successful here. So that's the erosive effect of micro-inequities and microaggressions. It's not one incident. Having your name confused with somebody else, that happens all the time. But if it's continually the same person day after day after day, it will really erode your morale and your self-esteem. And you will come to believe that you have no chance of being successful at this organization, you have to move on. Here's another example of a micro-inequity or a microaggression that came up. This just happened a couple weeks ago. Is anybody familiar with this news story? Within 24 hours of each other, there were actually 7 of them, but we only have pictures of 6. These 6 men were arrested for the same crime in the same area. 3 University of Iowa wrestlers and 3 men of color. The same reporter wrote up the story for the same journal, but he used the yearbook photos for the University of Iowa wrestlers and used the mugshots for the men of color. So, who already looks guilty before trial? And what story plants the seed into a potential jury pool about which people are criminals and which are just a group of prankster kids? And why weren't mugshots good enough for University of Iowa wrestlers? Well, what they said was that it took a lot more trouble to get the mugshot, so he hadn't gone to the trouble the day before to get the mugshots, but the next day he went to the trouble to get the mugshots. What? That doesn't make much sense to me. So the worst part is that the author of this news article didn't say to himself, I'm going to use mugshots for these guys and yearbook photos for these guys. It's really becoming conscious and being a good diversity and inclusion ally is being aware that anyone could do something like this without even thinking about it. And being willing to be called out and have somebody say to you, did you realize that you did this way? And then say, oh my goodness, all right, I have to make reparations on this, I have to fix this, and I have to think more thoroughly about what I do in the future. It's not about saying I'm not a racist because I treat everybody the same. It's about realizing that you could accidentally treat somebody differently. So we call America the melting pot, right? Well, that's not working at all. The melting pot myth, melting pots are for chocolate chips or for cheese, whatever you like. People are much more like a salad. You don't take lettuce and tomatoes and onions and cucumbers and throw them in a blender and blend them all up and pour them into glasses and then serve them with different dressings. The idea with a salad is that the different flavors and textures and characteristics of each piece bring something new to the salad. And that's how we have to start looking at our workplaces. We have this indoctrination of colorblindness. And it's just not the case. If I was standing up here with someone of another race, you could clearly see the difference between us. So pretending that we don't see differences is not an effective way. It might have been a good idea in the 60s because we were just trying to figure this whole thing out, but it hasn't gotten us very far and it isn't going to get us where we want to go. So this is the awareness continuum. This is what we're all trying to do all the time. Very few people wake up in the morning and go out and they say, I am going to go be actively biased against a group of people and ruin someone's day. I don't think too many people do that. Most of us are somewhere in the middle towards the right over here. So we may have unconscious biases and we have to work to try to continue to move along that continuum to become more actively anti-biased. So people were asked, what is it that stops you from saying something when you witness something disrespectful or you witness somebody else doing something that is demonstrating a bias? And they said, all right, so let me back up. When you witness bias, you have the choice to reinforce it, to go along, or to laugh at it, to remain silent, which is to tolerate it, or to interrupt it. And interrupt it is the hardest of all. When people asked why they stayed silent, they answered, they didn't know what to say. Well, those people weren't talking to me. I didn't know if anybody would back me up. It wasn't my business. Who am I to jump in? I was afraid I'd lose my temper, and I didn't want to embarrass anyone. So some of these are understandable. I think that we have to reframe the way we interact with others. So when we go by someone and they're having some type of an exchange and we overhear something, if you're a bystander, you are part of the conversation in the audience. So if you heard it, you're part of the conversation and you have the right, and I might even argue the responsibility, to say something. Somebody said something to me recently. They said, people going from bystanders to being upstanders. I really like that idea.